Hello, I'm Dr. Ruth Cruickshank and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at Royal Holloway, University of London. So why is food so interesting but also so important? Of course, it's essential to us. Without eating and drinking, we would die. Luckily, it's also delicious a lot of the time. But food is also one of the things that differentiates the behaviour of human animals and other animals. As human animals, we're able to think about food simultaneously in the past, the present and the future. As human animals, we're also busy telling ourselves stories to try and make sense of the world in which we live, which is why looking at fiction and film, the stories we tell ourselves, is a really, really important thing to do. And food also operates as a language. We imbue it with all sorts of different kinds of meaning, but those meanings are always provisional, they're always ambivalent. And these are the kind of leftovers that I'm particularly interested in. So I'm sure you'll already have thought about this, but food is a brilliant tool for writers of fiction and filmmakers in their craft, and they use it knowingly. Anyone who sat around the table for a celebratory meal with their family, knows that food can bring conflict. So that can help move a plot on. Food is also great in characterisation, and the man who eats meat, the person who eats little, we infer things to do with character in relation to food. And novelists and filmmakers, of course, knowingly use food for symbolism. So they draw on the potential meanings that circulate around food deliberately in order to suggest things in their narratives. So what I'm particularly interested in is moving away from what novelists, filmmakers, thinkers and artists might think they're doing with food, to looking at the unthought of meanings that reside in their representations of food. So the kind of leftover, unthought of meanings that I look at are ideological, they're historical, and they're also psychological. And they're all always ambivalent and provisional. So some of the ways of teasing out some of these meanings might be going through thinking around the idea of incorporation. So when we incorporate food, we at once do something which is an assertion of our own identity. At the same time, the movement of taking the food into our body breaches our integrity. So there is that ambivalence. And at the same time, we are doing this as part of a food community. So our own identity is being subsumed into the group. So there are all sorts of different things going on there with the act of eating. Food at the same time can bring us pleasure, but also danger. So it's a very ambivalent substance. Eating is a very ambivalent action. And mentioning identity there, of course, brings us into ideas of distinction, of inclusion and exclusion that can come along with food. So certain groups may exclude other groups deliberately through their foodways or assert their own identity through their foodways. But this can also happen on an unthought of level. So the food choices that you make may have been inflected by your social, cultural and economic capital without you knowing. The kind of food that we eat and the kind of foods we don't eat. All of these things occur in representations of food without the author or the filmmaker or the thinker or the artist realising. And when we're talking about distinction, about inclusion and exclusion, of course, that then brings us open to think about class, about gender, about all of that domestic labour that women undertake in the production of food that in so many fictions and films goes without saying. And also about ethnicity. Coming back then to the idea of the historical, there is nothing at all innocent about the representation of sugar or coffee, for example, which have their leftovers of the slave trade. So food is therefore intensely political there. So I've covered some of the ideas of the ideological and the historical that we can see in representations of food. And then, of course, there are the psychological meanings which may be bound up with food. There are psychoanalytical theories which suggest that we come into individuation, that we become a subject when we are weaned, when we are severed from our mother's breast, creating a sense of trauma, a sense of lack that can never be fulfilled, a kind of hunger. So representations of hunger and appetite are really interesting in that perspective. So I hope this has given you a taste of how you might be able to identify some leftover meanings yourselves in your reading and your viewing whenever you encounter food and drink.